Our program replaces the liberal idea of the individual and the Marxist concept of humanity with the people, a people defined by its blood and rooted in its soil. This may be a simple and concise sentence, but its consequences are colossal. Oline and salutations once again to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on this planet. I am here again, I think on the 5th of September, with a follow-up to my talk on the deceit of Christ, as I promised. And today I'd like to go right to the core of what I regard as the fundamental moral and spiritual problem facing humanity. And that problem is rooted in the concept of humanity itself. And unfortunately, as I've previously noted, the concept of humanity has been attached to the image and mission of a figure called Jesus Christ. So in some respect, you can argue that Jesus Christ or the Christ is the icon of the human species. It is taken as such by many millions and millions of people. And this is a fundamental error in the human psyche, a fundamental mistake in the way that human beings view themselves that must be corrected and discarded in order to reach the beauty to come. I might say here that one of the things, lessons, messages, insights, whatever you want to call it, that I've attempted to get across to the world in Not in His Image has been a great challenge to me. I'm addressing something in a certain way. I'm taking a certain tack on this problem in a certain way, coming from the Gnostic viewpoint. And it's only from the Gnostic viewpoint that this problem can be resolved and overcome. It's really a problem about you and I and everyone regarding how they view their own humanity and identity. So you have a concept and a feeling about your own identity as a person, right? As a limited individual person. But you also connect that. You cannot avoid connecting that with a general sense that you have about your concept and feeling of humanity at large. And this is precisely the problem. It stands in that connection between your sense of identity as a single person and your sense of identity as a member of humanity. Now let it be clear that I'm not accosting or attacking anyone in what I'm saying now. I'm not making assumptions about you who are listening. I'm simply voicing an issue that concerns all of us. Where and how this issue touches you, involves you, if it does, and I would argue that you cannot not be involved, that is for you to decide. Now, I've opened this talk with a quotation from an individual that I will not name. But you will know who that individual is if I say he is considered to be the most evil person in the world, at least as known in recent history of the last 100 years. So you have been told to think that of this individual, and many, many people do. But I just want to advise you of two things. In the first place, that view that he is the most evil man that ever lived is not universally held by millions of people across the planet. In fact, there are an untold number of millions who have admiration and respect for that individual. But the way the game is rigged, you're not even allowed that option. So you are a bad person if you look upon this individual with respect and admiration based on the evidence, based on the actual facts of his life and his intention and his mission and everything that involves him. I submit to you that if you are truly free, if you are a heretic who chooses what to believe rather than let it be dictated by others, then you have the opportunity to consider this individual as many others do, not as the most evil man who ever lived, but as an exceptional character in history. And his story has so much to tell us about the past, the present, and the future. Second point I want to make is this. In offering that quotation, I signal you to the very great fact that there is an option to what I'm calling universality. There is another worldview. There is another position to take on the identity of the human species in the spectrum of the races. There is another view that you can take if you decide, as I do, to take a stand against what I'm calling universality. So the solution is already there. The option to a more sane and humane view of what it means to be human is already there. However, that viewpoint is absolutely and completely taboo. You cannot even cite it. You cannot even refer to it without the risk of being canceled or banished from the conventional forms of social media. You cannot even refer to it in ordinary, common conversation without the risk of being looked upon as a bad person, looked upon as someone who is evil and must be rejected and condemned merely by the fact that you would bring up the ideology associated with that particular individual. Yet in that ideology resides what you can grandiosely call the salvation of humanity. Now, all this relates intimately to the race card and the issue of race, which also is an issue that in some respects is prohibited from discussion by a taboo, but then on the other hand, there's a great deal of nasty and deceptive rhetoric about the subject of race. Now, I have argued on numerous occasions, that there is no problem with race, really, in the human animal. I can speak as an individual. I don't have any problem with race, with one exception. I don't have any racial prejudice against people. And at the same time, I do discriminate among races. I do that for my enjoyment and my enlightenment, because I regard races as different, with different capacities, manners, attitudes, styles. I look upon that with interest, and I hold an open mind toward the behavior of all different races. But at the same time, I do judge individuals of any race according to their behavior, and I hold individuals of any race responsible regardless of their race. For instance, if there is a lineup of criminals who have been brought in by an investigative team, and they have apprehended these criminals, and they have determined by evidence that they are members of a gang of arsonists, and they are burning down houses and burning people alive and committing horrific crimes. And there they are, 10 of them standing up against a wall. And the evidence is there that proves beyond a reasonable doubt that they have perpetrated this crime of arson. So we're looking at them in the lineup. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And suddenly someone observes, well, hold on. One of those individuals is an Albanian. And you know the story about the Albanians, don't you? They're the best people on earth. They have been chosen by the very Creator to rule over all the other nations, the Goyim. And so, even though there's an Albanian in the lineup, or maybe 9 Albanians in the lineup, we all have to agree that we let them go because they are faultless and they can never be accused of doing any harm without facing a tremendous blowback to anyone who makes that accusation. You see what I'm getting at? That's a problem of universality, because the concept of universality comes from the Albanians. So again, speaking for myself personally, I am an equal opportunity racist. I am ready, willing, and able to hold any member of any race responsible for their actions. There is no race which, by definition of its race, can be absolved from doing harm. Do you see that? So I don't care if they're Hispanics, Asians, Argentinians, Eskimos. I don't care who those men and some women in the lineup are. All I care about is their responsibility for the deeds that they commit, regardless of their race. So I am an equal opportunity racist. Of course, racist is a slur, and some people have argued that it's an anti-white slur. And there's a lot of truth in that statement. The correct term here, of course, is racialist or racial realist. Now, my intention here is to go directly and brutally to the point. And one of the points I want to make is that you never see before you an example of humanity in the generic sense. Neither you nor I nor anyone has ever encountered a generic human being, a pure anthropine. It's rather like the case of the canine species or the feline species. You've never really encountered one of those. All you encounter is breeds. So there are breeds of dogs, but there is no pure generic dog. Likewise, there is no pure generic human being on this planet. All anthropines, as I call human animals, appear before you, including yourself, as a derivative. That's what tad means, T-A-D. I call people tads. It means a tertiary anthropine derivative. So you are a racial derivative of one unique species, the human species. You are, of course, in a sense, like myself, purely and originally human. But you can't go to that identity without going through the racial derivative of that identity. You see? if you really recognize other people, then you delude yourself in thinking that you are just seeing a human being. It's sort of like raw milk. I've used this analogy. I happen to love raw milk, and I've had the pleasure of drinking raw milk, raw, unpasteurized, unhomogenized milk. So the true generic human is like raw milk, but you never get a chance to taste that because all the milk that's offered to you is processed. It's pasteurized, homogenized, or flavored, you see? So you see different flavored human animals. And some of them are pure breeds of a race, and some of them are crossbreeds within a certain race, and some of them are crossbreeds of different races. And that is all you ever see, realistically speaking, when you encounter human beings, as well as when you look into yourself. I'm a crossbreed between two white races, the Irish and the Italian. I am not a crossbreed of any variety of the white races, of which there are many, with another race, such as the Mongoloid, or Asian races, or the so-called Negroid, or black-skinned races. No, I'm not that kind of crossbreed. I'm a crossbreed within two variations of the Aryan Caucasian races. So the term race mixing could apply to me in a way, but not really. What race mixing means is interbreeding between people of different races. All right, so far so good. What am I doing here? I'm framing the argument against universality. So what is universality? How can you define it? Well, I can assure you, and mark my words very carefully, that universality is a trick and a trap comparable to what is called, in commercial terms, bait and switch. So, bait and switch in business means that the seller, for instance, of household products like a toaster, puts in the window a certain toaster, a certain model, and says, this is on special offer. But then when you go in, you find out that it's not that model exactly which is on offer for you to buy, but no, they have another one instead. And that is called bait and switch. It is known to be a deceptive and dishonest commercial policy. But I warn you, it is also a deceptive and dishonest political policy. How many times have you heard in the media, or perhaps in some direct personal situation, that someone stands before you and they tell you that they are speaking in the cause of humanity? They are actually, in doing that, presenting you with a bait and switch. If you buy their program, their agenda, their message, thinking that you embrace the cause of humanity by doing so, the actual result that you receive is different than what you believe it to be. Very, very different. Now, there are many variations of this bait and switch formula. It takes various forms. Let me give you one example. Definition of that formula that came into expression through Karl Marx, wrote the Communist Manifesto with Engels around 1850, is, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. So in the ideology of Marxism, the proletariat, in quotes, is intended deceptively to represent the ordinary people, the working class people. It is a class-defined concept, but at the same time, it is a universalist concept. So the notion of Marxism, the deceptive program, says this program is designed for the cause or betterment or fulfillment of the proletariat. But it's a bait and switch. If you go and look at the evidence of history, look at what the Soviet Bolshevik regime actually did to the proletariat or the working class in Russia. You see, the message of Marxism, on the one hand, that is the Marxist concept of universalism, as you see in that quotation, is a lie. Because behind that terminology, what is operating is the intent to deceive and destroy the very people that it addresses. You see? You find the same thing today in the propaganda coming from the World Economic Forum. Those who belong to that forum, who consist, as I understand, of about 1,000 organizations and corporations that are the most rich and powerful in the world, they are dictating to humanity a program or a plan for the future of the entire human species, all races, presumably. And you find in the language of that outrageous propaganda the constant use of the terms we and you. So the World Economic Forum, which begins with the letters WE, meaning we, state that we, meaning the members of the forum, the globalist overlords, have an intention for you, humanity at large, and we dictate to you how you must live and how you shall live. That is a universalist proposition. But it's obvious, isn't it, that the we, the overlords who are defining that proposition, set themselves apart from the rest of humanity upon whom they are imposing it. And this is an old, old trick that goes back to the scriptures of the Old Testament. I pointed out some years ago in a couple of talks I gave that can't be found on YouTube anymore, but you can find them on BitChute. I pointed out that the record of history shows, especially the record of the history of religions, with particular attention to Judaism, the record of history shows that those who have defined humanity set themselves apart from it. They don't define humanity as if they belong to it. They define humanity as something apart from them, upon which they assert their supremacy, and toward whom they dictate the rules of life. This is a simple and plain conclusion that can be drawn from those ancient scriptures, which are the taproot of master race supremacy. Now, I've explained this at length in Not in His Image. Also, in a talk that I think you can find on my channel, I raised this terribly difficult point. I know it's intimidating, and I know it's difficult to face. Believe me, I do. But I raised this point do you realize that your concept of humanity doesn't actually come from yourself? And if that is so, it begs the question, could there be a concept of humanity and a sense of humanity, a feeling for it, that does come uniquely from yourself and is not dictated or derived externally? Well, yes, that could be. That could be so. But it is not something that you have in the frame of your general conditioning as a human being living in the 21st century. Everyone living in the 21st century, of whatever race in whatever country, is living with a concept of humanity that has been given externally. Now, you may object to that, and I respect your objection, and I think I know exactly why you would object. You would object, for instance, by saying, well, hold on a minute there, big boy. I have my concept of humanity that I carry in my inmost self, and I know what it means to be human, because I am human. And I look at other people, and I confer in my observation of other people that same sense of humanity on them. So what I feel is my humanity that I carry in myself is also present in others. And so I respect that and I observe that. And in that way, I feel and believe that I hold myself in solidarity with the human species, no matter what the race of others may be. Well, that's all fine and lovely, and you may really enjoy that feeling, but I warn you that you need to look closely into that feeling. On that issue, and I want to go further into that in a moment, I might interject an essential teaching of the living gnosis today. This teaching is epitomized in 3 lines from a gold leaf amulet discovered in southern Italy at the end of the 19th century. This is called the Patelia Amulet, and it's very famous. You can go look it up with a search engine. You'll find there are even sites dedicated to this marvelous artifact. It's thought to be an artifact, a sacred artifact. It's about the size of a postage stamp. It's a gold leaf square with certain writing inscribed on it. It's thought that this artifact, the Patelia Amulet, was given to people at their death when they were dying and was buried with them, and that's where it was found, in graves. And it indicated that the individual in the grave had been an initiate of a certain Gnostic cult. Most scholars presume that it was an Orphic variation of Gnosticism. And this amulet placed in the grave represented evidence that that individual found there had been initiated into a great mystery. So what was that mystery? Well, it was the mystery, the ultimate mystery of human origin and human identity. So the 3 lines of the Pitalia Amulet, which I now quote and discuss in the 2021 edition of Not in His Image, it was not included before, go like this. I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my origins are in heaven alone. You yourself know this. Those are the 3 lines of the Patelia Amulet. So what do they teach? What do they say? They teach you that the generic human being the anthropos in Gnostic language, is imaginal. It's something that you can only imagine. Well, how then do you imagine it? Well, you imagine it by knowing the narrative, the origin story of the human species, which is contained in the fallen goddess scenario. And it's extremely precise and extremely concrete. And there's a place you can look in the heavens, in the sky, and you can see with your naked eye where the human genome is embedded in the cosmos. That is where you come from. That is the source of the generic humanity. You are a child of earth and starry heaven, but your origins are in heaven alone. This is premier Gnostic intel, and I assure you, my friends, that you do not hear this said in this way anywhere else in the world unless it comes from living Gnostics today. All that being so, I can assure you that yes, there is a generic sense of humanity, inclusive of all races, and you can know what it is, and you can imagine it, but you never encounter it as such. All that you encounter are the racial variations of that primordial cosmic humanity. When you know this, you know something truly wonderful. You know something that liberates you from the deceit of universality. Having said that, let me return directly and brutally to what you feel about your own humanity. I'm addressing you, not accusing you of anything. I'm not assuming what you believe or don't believe. But I'm attempting to speak to you in the most open and universal way. Okay? Your sense of humanity, like mine and that of everyone else, has two factors. There is a concept and there is a feeling. So the feeling is primary. And it is true that the feeling is unique and arises within you, undetermined by anything else. You sense yourself to be human. You sense yourself to be what I call a human animal. And by extension, when you look at others, you presume that that same sense of humanity is present in them. Well, that right there is a really big problem. Because in fact, upon the examination of evidence and the proof of behavior, that is not true. There are animals walking around on this planet who do not act from an innate sense of humanity. They act in ways, they exhibit behaviors that are insane and inhumane. And those behaviors originate from an alien factor in the human condition. An alien factor, a paranormal factor. And some of those who carry that paranormal factor know exactly who they are, and they don't consider themselves to be the same as you, but they presume to define for you what your humanity is. And that is the root of all the evil and deception on this planet, the presumption of a race that considers itself to be above and superior to all others, yet dictates to all the other races what is human identity. That is the core evil of universality. So, naturally, you have a sense of your innate humanity and the sense of the innate humanity of others, as I do as well. But the sense is a sense, and the sense never stands alone. It goes along with a concept. And I have argued that the concept of humanity carried by billions of people around the planet is not their own product. It is something taught to them or dictated to them externally. Now, I also dictate externally, you could say, a concept of humanity. I do. I offer, through Gnostic teaching, a certain concept of humanity, but I don't impose it on anyone. I don't dictate it to anyone. And I don't even hold anyone to that standard of humanity, because I know in fact, existentially, in brutal fact, that there are many cases where human beings do not live up to the standard of humanity that can be described in the Gnostic teachings and in the framework of the Sophianic myth, the fallen goddess scenario. You need a myth, you need a narrative to frame your concept of humanity. And the narrative of the wisdom goddess is unique and paramount in that respect. You can learn a concept of humanity that cannot be acquired from elsewhere through the Gnostic intel. Let me give you an example of the application of that intel. Everyone sort of knows what DNA is. So DNA is the coding of the human genome, right? There's another expression I use that is helpful to describe the condition of humanity, and I call it the RPL, race, place, and language. So in fact, every single human animal that you encounter, including yourself, in some way or another, fits those three parameters. Race, you belong to a certain racial ancestry. Place, you were born in a certain place and may still be attached to that place as your homeland. And language, you learned as a child a certain language, and your language is a factor of your identity. The Mandarin language is a factor in the identity of Asian peoples. The Toltec languages are a factor in the identity of the indigenous Mexican peoples. The Greek language is obviously a factor in the identity of Greek peoples. So think of the RPL, race, place, and language, whenever you meet someone, and meet them in the recognition that that defines their identity as a human being, and there is no such other universal or overriding factor in identity, except if you go to the narrative, the sacred narrative of the mysteries, that gives you a true picture of the ultimate transracial identity of the human being. I assure you that the problem, one of the great social problems and spiritual problem, if you want to use that term, on this planet, is not race. Race and racial differences are not the problem. They are part of the solution. The recognition of those differences is a huge factor in the solution. The respect of those differences and the enjoyment of them in comparison is something wonderful to learn. But making race a problem is the problem. And making race a problem is a program of those who teach universality. Try to get your mind around that one. Now this talk is proceeding rapidly. It's already going to 40 minutes. And I'd like to wind it off because I don't want to ramble on and rant at you for another half an hour. So how can I round it off? Well, how about this? if I appeal once again to that sense of humanity that you have, the problem with that is, although it may be true, although it may be profoundly true, and something that you cannot live without, the way that you handle it depends upon your concept. The way that you manage your innate sense of humanity depends upon your concept of human identity, both in the individual, racial, and generic senses. Not both, but in all three senses: individual, racial, and generic. And as I've said, the generic or true universal concept of humanity is imaginal. You can only imagine it. You cannot ever actually encounter it. But that concept of universality has been hijacked, and the ultimate evil manifestation of that hijacking in the world today is communism and the program of communism. Now, there was a really famous and influential man who lived in the 20th century, and his name was Stephen Wise, Rabbi Stephen Wise. And there's a quotation from that man that goes like this: "Some call it communism. I call it Judaism." Now, that quotation does not stand alone, coming from that individual and from his particular racial breed. In fact, there are dozens of other direct quotations which support that view. Now, communism is a program of world domination based on master race ideology. Who is the master race today, or who was it in the past? Well, it certainly wasn't the group of people, the entire nation, who followed the most evil man in the world, because if you go and look into the details of that program, of that nation who stood up against communism, you find that the concept of master race is not present in their ideology. No, not at all. You have a case with that nation and their leaders in the 20th century of what is called accusatory inversion. So they were accused of holding and implementing an ideology of master race supremacy, which is not true. You cannot find it in any of the written or spoken evidence of that period. But in fact, those who accuse them of master race ideology are in fact the true proponents of master race ideology. That is called accusatory inversion, blaming others for doing to you what you in fact do to them. And that is a tactic of universality and of those who promote the idea of universality, that we are all one, that all we have to do is recognize the humanity in each other, love each other and embrace each other in unconditional love, and come together in the solidarity of a universal human identity. It's never going to happen. And anyone who adapts that from their basic feeling of humanity is going to be tragically disappointed. Or better said, betrayed. A point that I made in the original introduction to Not in His Image concerns what led me to write the book. And I pointed out that I was deeply troubled from an early age by the perception, the insight, which I could not understand. It was an insight that I knew was true, but I could not figure it out. And the insight was that humanity betrays itself most profoundly through its highest spiritual and religious ideals. And one of those ideals is this concept of universality, which obligates you to recognize the humanity in everyone as you recognize it in yourself. Well, how's that working out for you lately? How's that working out for you when you can go out on the street in the ordinary course of human affairs and be confronted and impeded by someone else who is just an ordinary citizen who stands in front of you and demands that you comply with insane and inhumane behavior? How's it working out for you, friends? I would say, in conclusion, and I must say also that this is a discussion that can never be concluded. It's a discussion, it's an argument and a problem that we all have to live with. But if we can rise to the occasion, we can master this argument and live with it to the betterment of all who do not intend harm. No harm intended except to those who intend harm. And there are many, many who intend harm among the globalist overlords and among all their stupid, ridiculous, blind minions and dupes on the ground. They intend harm. And I advise you that the least of the members of that deceit, the perpetrators of that deceit, the least of them that you encounter on the street are as guilty of insane and inhumane behavior as those overlords at the top of the pyramid. And they need to be confronted as they are responsible for perpetrating the crime against humanity, coming now, culminating now on this precious planet. As that crime culminates in the next 6 months, leading into the spring of the year 2022, you have the opportunity to resolve that crime, to oppose and overcome the perpetrators of that crime. But as long as you adhere to the deceit of universality, which is represented and embodied in some respects hugely by the figure of Christ, the Christ within you, the humanity within you, your Christ consciousness, as long as you adhere to that deceit, you cannot but betray yourself. Such is the nefarious trap of this deceit. No, you cannot love everyone equally. You cannot do that. You don't need to do that. And if you attempt to do that, or if you attempt to maintain that feeling of universal solidarity, I can only say, watch out. It's something that can destroy you and destroy your life. And there are those who count on it doing just that. Enough said. And I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.